Hi everyone, welcome to another Thursday Tips and Tricks. Today we're going to be specifically speaking about making flying geese using the Fast Flying Geese method and using the wing clipper tool. And I'm going to talk about the hints and the tips that I find myself repeating over and over again anytime I'm giving a class that involves the wing clipper and flying geese. And if you're not familiar with the process, you're going to want to learn how to do these things by watching my video, and you can find that by visiting my website. But what I'm going to include today are little fixes that will help you get better quality and better success with your flying geese. So let's start right at the beginning. The Fast Flying Geese method is like a magic trick. You actually start with 5 squares, 1 big and 4 small, and from 5 squares you end up with 4 finished flying geese. Now, this is where I do my first fix. When the pattern tells me, or the instructions tell me, to cut my squares 3 inches, I actually cut my squares 3 inches plus a couple threads. And I do that by placing my 3-inch guidelines on my tool that I'm cutting my squares with completely on the fabric so that that square is a little bit bigger, just a thread or two bigger than 3 inches. That's one way that you can add a little bit of extra wiggle room in your process. One of the other steps in the process is to mark guidelines, and those are stitching guidelines 1/4 inch from the center, and I mark those using my quilter's magic wand. And I frequently see students in my classes pull out these great big heavy duty chalk pencils that are dull and start marking. That's never going to give you a good result. What you want to do is use fine lines. If you're going to use a pencil, use a mechanical pencil. A .05 has a nice fine line on it. If you're going to use some of the Pigma micron pens, realize that they come in sizes. If you can find the .005, that's the size that I like to use on a regular basis. The .01 is pretty good, but stay away from the .05. It's a little too broad. And you know, one of the things that I always do, no matter what I'm using for my marking, is I mark just dark enough so that I can see the lines at my sewing machine. I never want to put more ink or more charcoal graphite onto my fabric than I need to. There are a couple other tools that are really nice when it comes to marking those lines. The friction pens are nice because they disappear when they're hit with a hot iron. But did you realize they also come in sizes? The regular friction has a fairly broad line, but they've come out with a new fine line friction that really is my choice every single time if I have a choice. And again, those are gone. Those lines disappear with heat. And inevitably in your marking process, in your construction process, you're going to end up having a dark fabric that needs to have the lines drawn on it. And if you do that, you're going to want to make sure to get a fine line chalk marker. Bowen has one, and Sewline also has one. And since we're talking about marking lines, this is another trick that I use. All of us old-time quilters used to have these sandpaper boards when we're marking on our fabric and tracing around our templates. It's nothing fancy. This is a nice fine grit sandpaper. And when I mark my squares, if I put that fabric on the sandpaper, when I go to draw lines, what happens is the fabric doesn't move. And that makes for a nice, easy marking. And here's one more trick. When you go to do your marking, and I'm going to set this up so that you're kind of looking right at me, don't put your pencil straight up and down to do your marking. Lean your pencil into and up against the edge of your magic wand so that you can get those lines very close. Oops, it looks like I'm out of lead. Very close to where they need to be. So use fine markers, use a sandpaper board, lean your pencil in, and those are all going to be things that are going to help you get better markings on those small squares. Now, after the squares are marked, the next step in the process is to stitch on the squares. And before we even go to the stitching, what I want to talk to you about is a step that's often forgotten, and that is the nudge. When you position the 2 small squares on the large square, the instructions tell you, and it's highlighted, to nudge those small squares in a little bit. Many times quilters forget the nudge, and if they do that, or if you find that you're running out of fabric on this edge when you go to trim, that's because you forgot the nudge. So don't forget the nudge. And here's one sewing trick that I tend to do automatically. I think about this as a railroad track, those two lines that are drawn on there, and instead of stitching right on the lines, I tend to stitch inside of the railroad tracks. Just a thread or two. That's going to give me a couple of extra thread on the smaller triangles and give me, again, a little more wiggle room. So these are some things that you might want to try if you're finding that you don't have as much fabric on your trim down, final trim down, as you can. Now, we've talked about marking, we've talked about stitching, we've talked about positioning. Let's talk about the pressing. Once you sew these and you're going to cut down the middle, the next step is to press these. This is where you need to slow down. Take your time. Do not get overzealous with your pressing. I usually use a pressing agent to set my seams, and then once I set my seams, try to slow down when you do that pressing, because if you're like me and you're in a hurry when you do that pressing, this is a long bias edge, and that pressing in a hurry will give you a smiley face on your a stretch on your bias, and it results in this scenario. If you've stretched the pressing and you go to trim, what you're going to find is that when you put the lines of your wing clipper tool on your unit, you are indeed going to have extra fabric all around the outside. But notice here, one line is on the seam and the other line is off. That happens because you hurried or didn't keep that bias edge nice and straight. Now, don't panic, because I'm going to show you how you go about fixing that unit. Let me remove the cutting pieces off of there. To fix that, what I have to try to do at my iron is to take those two seams and nudge them a little closer together. And I do that with steam. Sometimes I'll do it with a little bit of a pressing agent, but I tend to hold one edge and nudge the other one up just a little bit, and then carefully, using my steam, nudging them closer together, narrowing that angle so that when I go to replace this on my cutting mat, I can see that instead of throwing that unit away, I now have a unit that has extra fabric on all the edges and has those guidelines lined up right there. So pressing caused the problem, let pressing fix the problem. So hopefully this is going to help you in your flying geese endeavors. If you don't have the wing clipper, make sure you get the original. Don't get any of the knockoffs that are out there right now. The original wing clipper has 10 different sizes on it, has fine lines for high precision, and the wing clipper one is the one that you'll find most often used in your patterns and in your projects. But you know, we also have the wing clipper 2, and the wing clipper 2 does 9 additional sizes, but all the sizes on the original wing clipper are based on whole inch and half inch. So 1 by 2, 1.5 by 3, 2 by 4 inch flying geese. There are designers out there who want you to make your flying geese 1.25 by 2.5 or 1 3/4. So the wing clipper 2 does 1/4 and 3/4 inch increments, and the wing clipper 1 does whole and half inch increments. These are 2 tools I'm sure you're gonna love having in your toolbox. And if you've had any of these issues, try some of these fixes to try and give you better success with your flying geese units. So that's all I have for today. We'll talk more about flying geese another time. I've got some more things that I want to share with you about those, but that's it for now. You guys have a great week, and I'll see you next Thursday.